Good evening, this is Andy Stevens, and this is our last assignment for EDL 852, Intro to Building Leadership, our case study, which encompasses Module 14. Let's begin by examining some of the facts of this case study. This case takes place in a small rural community, which is comprised of over 60% of farmers. Currently 2 schools in the district, 1 elementary and 1 combined 7 through 12 junior and senior high that is housed in 1 physical building. Population in this community is growing for 3 primary reasons. Number 1, the value of land is still relatively cheap, and so people are attracted to the area for that. The schools are relatively new. I believe the elementary school is just over 20 years old, and the junior senior high is in the mid-teens as far as age is concerned. And then the last reason that the population of this area is growing is due to the fact that it is not far from a large urban area, which attracts people to having the amenities of the urban area without many of the headaches. Another major concern of the community and a big fact of this case is the fact that because it is an agricultural-based community, there's an influx of immigrants. Most of those immigrants have families and kids, and so that has changed the dynamics and the needs of the school district. Additionally, 2 new Board of Education members ran and were elected and have championed the idea of opening a new school to help relieve some of the overcrowding that is currently happening at the existing facilities. Some additional facts. The superintendent, based upon the recommendation of the Board of Education, recommends that a study be conducted with an educational planner and a building architect. Those 2 entities come together and presented 3 different options to the Board of Education as well as the superintendent. The last option was recommended by the architects and the planner. Option 3 was recommended. And then really what that led to was the community being kind of divided into 3 different factions. Each one of these options obviously had pros and cons. And because of that, there were members of the community that were supporting the various options, much like they would a political candidate. Eventually, the Board of Education approves option 3, which was to build a brand new school, a brand new facility. And then Superintendent Rawlings hires a lady who is named Susan Potter to be the principal of the new school. Susan Potter is widely considered to be an expert in middle school education, comes highly recommended to the district, and while having some hesitations about taking the job, ultimately decides to pursue it for her own professional advancement. Lastly, once Principal Potter has been placed and in charge of the new school, she forms an advisory committee. She refers to this committee as a planning committee, which meets regularly to begin the planning of the new school. Immediately, there's some conflict that arises among the committee, driven by the very varying perspectives relating to vision and philosophy, mission statements. Many members of the committee believe that because Principal Potter is the expert in middle school education, that she should just create the vision and the philosophy statements surrounding the school. Principal Potter believes that it should be a collaborative effort, and we'll dive more into that challenge here in a minute. But ultimately, Principal Potter is tasked with creating the guiding documents for the new school. Let's talk about some legal and ethical issues that exist in this case. Upon examining the case, I didn't identify any laws that were currently being broken or potentially could be broken. However, I did identify 3 primary ethical challenges that are present. Number 1 the way that Helen is behaving on the committee. I think many would consider her behavior to be borderline bullying, especially towards Principal Potter. I also have a strong opposition ethically to the relationship between Helen, who's kind of the leader of the advisory committee, and the fact that one of her family members is on the Board of Education for this small community. And then lastly, many people argue ethically that a vision statement shouldn't be created by a single person or entity, that it should be a collaborative document that is living and breathing, because there's such a strong correlation between a school's culture and the vision that is created. And so the more stakeholders you can involve in that, the more comprehensive it will be, and hence the stronger the culture of that facility. Additionally, if we really just boil the problem of this case down, I think it boils down to this, and that is, how does Principal Potter lead this school while also respecting the wishes of the committee, her boss, the Board of Education, and all the other stakeholders that are not included, such as parents, other faculty of the school, the students, general community members, so on and so forth. If we look at some of the other people, places, and programs involved in this case, we've talked about Principal Potter, we've talked about Superintendent Rawlings, we've talked about the Board of Education, and we've talked about the members of the advisory committee, made up primarily of the staff that have been hired and parents of the new school. Some of the key places in this case deal with the various demographics of the community, the fact that it is very agriculturally driven, that most of the population are farmers, the fact that the new school will be built on the same site of the existing buildings. And then what we don't know, and what might help us get a better understanding for future growth, is how big is that area 10 miles away? Are we talking a city of 100,000 people? Are we talking a metropolitan area of 1 million people? I think knowing more of that demographic information would be essential. The programs that are involved in this case are any programs that you would find in a traditional middle school. Those could be curricular areas like the core classes versus the electives. Are we looking at athletics and their needs and how their facilities have to be constructed? What about extracurricular activities? And then lastly, what about support services for students that have any sort of learning disabilities, physical disabilities, emotional support, things of that nature? So those are the primary players as we look at this case. If we're looking to prioritize the information, I think it's first most important to talk about what stakeholders have been impacted the most, and really identifying those groups and making sure that you're targeting your solutions towards those groups. Again, who has a stake in the outcome? And then who are you consulting? Who are you, who expertise are you tapping into to make sure you're building the best possible school and culture that you can? And then as you're prioritizing information, you always have to ask yourself, what do I know versus what do I still need to know? And then identifying those gaps in your knowledge. Once you know all that stuff, I think it's important that you identify the options that you would have as Principal Potter. So again, the case boils down basically to, how am I going to handle the conflict between the advisory committee that's been created and their desire for me to create all of the vision statements, all of the philosophy documents, the mission statement. They want me to do that by myself, while my desire as the principal of the new school is to do this collaboratively. So option number one, obviously, is you can do nothing and just create the vision statement as the board has requested. Number two, you could go to the other end of the spectrum and dig in and say, I'm not going to do it at all until we can come to a consensus as a committee. Or option three, in my opinion, is you would go up to your boss and the Board of Education and ask them to collaborate with you to help create these guiding documents that are going to shape this brand new school and its culture. So based on those three options, you need to evaluate the pros and the cons. So If we do nothing and just create the philosophy and vision statement as requested, obviously the pros are that's going to please the committee, and it's also going to give Principal Potter the autonomy to create the vision however she sees fit. The downsides or the cons to that option are simply that it goes against her professional and personal beliefs, as well as what are the ramifications with the committee down the line. If all you're doing is appeasing the committee, essentially you're setting the precedence that you'll do whatever they tell you to do. Option 2, the other end of the spectrum, where you dig in and refuse to do anything. Obviously the pros of that are that you're standing up for what you believe in, and that the philosophy statement would mirror the will of the group. It would be a collaborative effort. The cons are you're now contradicting the committee directly, which ultimately would lead to conflict between Principal Potter and the committee, which is made up of some of her new subordinates. Probably not a great way to get your school year started. The last option is if you go and collaborate with district leadership, that helps build a strong relationship with your boss, and it shows that because you're collaborating, it satisfies your original intent for the vision to be a collaborative effort. The downside, obviously, is that you will upset the committee because you basically went above their heads, and it's not really the philosophy or the vision of the committee and the group. It would be the philosophy of the principal and the superintendent. So you have to make a choice ultimately. And so to make the best possible decision for all stakeholders, I would choose option 1. I would implement the decision in a certain way, and I would express my concerns at the next committee meeting that I had about this option. And I would make sure that they understood that we're going to continue to work as a group, and that I'm going to work with all stakeholders to refine and polish this vision and mission statement. So to implement this decision, here's what I would do. As a building leader, the first thing I would do is I would make sure that I was bringing a draft to the next committee meeting. I would make it very clear that this is a draft. It is not the final document, and it will not become final until it is ratified or approved by the entire committee. I would look for feedback. It talks about in the case that the committee is very adamant that they'll be willing to provide feedback to Principal Potter whenever she asks for it. So I would be open and willing to hear that feedback. And then I would also go seek out other stakeholders. I would still talk to the superintendent. I would still talk to the Board of Education. I would talk to parents in the community, especially because, as we remember from earlier on, the community was very split based on their passions and their beliefs. So by talking to the community, you're increasing buy-in as a leader, which I think is really important. And then again, with the committee, I would continue to promote my belief of collaboration and how important it is that as the advisory committee and the guiding group of people for this brand new school, we have to be willing to work together to satisfy the needs of our school and to build a school that's going to have a really strong culture. So that about does it for my Module 14 case study. I apologize for the technical glitches there at times. But thanks for another great class, and hope you guys have a good evening.